Dear viewers, today we take up a lesson on natural law theological approach. Natural law philosophy is that branch of inquiry concerned with the validity of the law rather than its structure or efficacy. It involves evaluations and judgments in relation to fundamental criteria that determines the validity of law. Theories of natural law, which seek to discover criteria and enunciate value statements, constitute an enduring aspect of Western jurisprudence. The doctrine of natural law is based on a belief that there are principles of law stronger than any statute. Nature is conceived as a legislator, the supreme legislator. The principle of natural law includes the validity of man-made laws should be tested by reference to absolute values. Absolute values are universal and eternal. Laws lacking moral validity are wrong and unjust. Unjust law is no law. As there is 25 centuries contribution to natural law theory, it is divided into 4 different periods, namely ancient period, medieval period, Renaissance period and modern period. This lesson is a study of natural law theories during medieval period. Generally, the period from 12th century to mid 14th century is reckoned as the medieval age in the European history. This period was dominated by the ecclesiastical, philosophical and legal doctrines which the Christian fathers propagated for establishing the superiority of church over the state. They used natural law theory to propagate Christianity and to establish a new legal order and political ideology based on morals and theology. Natural law acquired a new role and phase during the medieval period. Like the Greeks, the church fathers were deeply interested in the maintenance of law and order to avoid chaos and conflicts which had swept Europe after the end of Roman Empire and eclipse of the Roman cultural and political domination over Europe. To maintain stability, status quo and peace, natural law was given theological interpretation. Catholic philosophers and theologians of the Middle Ages gave a new theory of natural law. When Rome lost its supremacy, the Christian church began to assert its power. It became the universal religion of Europe and was organized on a hierarchical pattern with the Pope as its head. The religious authorities began to claim supremacy over the political authorities and asserted that the Christian teaching was the embodiment of the supreme law. During the medieval period, natural law was given religious color. During the dark period between the collapse of ancient civilization and the emergence of the medieval order, the fathers of the church preserved the continuity of the idea of natural law and at the same time began to give it a different meaning and foundation. In essence, the Christian fathers, especially Ambrose, Augustine and Gregory, postulated the supremacy of divine law over all other laws by making the divine law or law of God ultimate criteria of divine reason. They further made efforts to identify the law of nature with law of God. Saint Isidore observed, all laws are either divine or human. Divine laws are based on nature, human laws on custom. According to Geerk, the medieval period Christian theology centered around two fundamental principles, namely, unity derived from God involving one faith, one church and one empire, and the supremacy of law, both divine and man-made, as a part of unity of universe. Friedman enumerated the 5 major trends of thought run through the innumerable writings and disputations of the medieval period. First, and the most important of all, political society and the state ceased to be considered as institutions of sin. Secondly, the medieval emphasis on law as the highest principle of society, binding rulers and ruled alike, that is, the supremacy of law. Thirdly, medieval philosophers, jurists and politicians confronted with a problem, that is, the authoritative interpretation of the supreme law. As both Pope and Emperor grew more powerful and ambitious, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the balance. Fourthly, the question of the source of legal authority within civil society arose. It is from this foundation that the later theories of social contract are developed. Lastly, the attitude of the medieval writers to private rights and in particular to the right to property marks the transition from the early Christian principle that all property is bad to the paramountcy and integrity of the right to private property, which reached its climax in the 19th century and which is now challenged by the modern growth of collectivism and planning. Medieval political and legal thought, which was developed from the 12th century to the beginning of the 14th century, reached its climax in the scholastic system of Saint Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas sought to advance the systematization of Catholic doctrine, in which law was viewed as an aspect of God's plan for mankind. Natural law did not begin with Aquinas. He built upon principles formulated by Greek and Roman scholars, including Aristotle and Cicero, who had written of the immutable unwritten laws of heaven. Within the Catholic Church, natural law doctrines had been shaped by scholars such as the following: Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine, who had been a professor of philosophy, asserted that a king-made law could be disregarded if it was contrary to the law of God. The Church, as the exponent of divine law, could interfere with and override the state. It implied that the ultimate interpreter of the law was the Pope and not the Emperor. This led to a struggle for power between the Church and the state. As both the state and the Church invoked the natural law to support their assertions, it marked a period of authority for natural law. Augustine believed that divine wisdom was revealed in the scriptures. The moral precepts of holy scriptures were the precepts of the natural law. According to him, man is governed by two laws, the law of nature and custom. The law of nature contained in the scriptures and the gospel. He said that natural law overrides customs and constitutions. Customs and constitutions which contradict natural law are void and of no effect. He asked, what are states without justice? Robber bands enlarged. Augustine preached the mankind that Church is the exponent of divine law. And just as human law could be ignored if it conflicts with divine law, so also might the Church intervene with institutions of positive law. With this growing emphasis on Church as the authentic exponent of divine law, and indictment of the state as an institution of sin, the hidden conflict between the spiritual and secular lawmaking authorities, that is, between Pope and Emperor, became more and more threatening. Both of the parties invoked natural law doctrines in support of their assertions. Augustine argued that positive law had to strive so as to fulfill the commands of the eternal law. In its role of guardian of God's eternal law, the Church had to exercise total sovereignty over the state. The provisions of worldly law should not conflict with the eternal natural law. Worldly law, which was unjust, could not be law. Augustine believed that divine wisdom was revealed in the Scriptures. Man cannot get salvation without the help of God, whose wisdom was incorporated in the Scriptures. It was the natural law which was identified with the Word of God. Thus, moral precepts of Holy Scriptures were the precepts of the natural law. Saint Isidore of Seville. The fathers of the Church from the 2nd to the 7th century refrained from expounding the concept of natural law, simply because their primary concern was to establish, defend and confirm the faith and the official doctrine of the Church in the midst of persecution. The first Christian philosopher to write on natural law was Isidore of Seville, the last of the ancient Christian philosophers. Saint Isidore distinguishes between divine law and human law. All laws are either divine or human. Divine laws are based on nature, human laws on customs. For this reason, human laws may disagree because different laws suit different peoples. Isidore further notes that since human laws are rooted in the customs of nations, they can vary from nation to nation and are not universal. The implication is that divine law rooted in nature does not so vary. The divine law is immutable because it has its source in nature, which is universal. Isidore urged that only those rulers who acted in a spirit of justice ought to command respect. Natural law ought to be obeyed by all. He describes this law as common to all nations and people, that it is everywhere held by instinct of nature, not by any enactment. In his etymology or origins, as it is sometimes called, the great Christian thinker gives some examples of objective rights deriving from the law of nature, as for instance, the union of man and woman, the generation and rearing of children, the common possession of things and the one liberty of all, the acquisition of those things which are taken from air and land and sea, also the return of a thing deposited or money loaned, the repulsion of force by force. After Isidore's excursus on natural law in the early Middle Ages, it is interesting to note that very few attempted to give further details about the theory until the high Middle Ages. In fact, Isidore's concept of jus natural was re-elaborated by the founder of the science of the canon law, Giovannis Grayson. Grayson, an Italian scholastic jurist, was the great compiler of canon law and effective founder of that field. His most famous work, Concordance of Discordant Canons, also known as the Decretum, was published around 1140 AD. In the 12th century, Grayson equated the natural law with divine law. He was of the view that because of its divine character, the natural law is binding and overrules all other laws. He said, natural law absolutely prevails in dignity over customs and constitutions. Whatever has been recognized by usage or laid down in writing, if it contradicts natural law, it must be considered null and void. But natural law was itself a product of human reason. It was an attempt on the part of man to recognize divine will in human affairs. Man, availing himself of natural law, was participating in the wisdom of God. By its inclusion in the legal system, natural law became a link between the minds of men and mind of God. Grayson begins his treatise on laws with the following division of the types of law making up the legal structure. The human race is ruled by two things: natural law and long-standing human customs. Grayson immediately sheds more light on this two-part division of law in the first causa of this first distinction when he quotes Isidore of Seville. All the laws that exist are either of divine or human origin. Divine laws are constituted by nature, but human laws are constituted by human customs, and therefore human laws differ from community to community because certain things are pleasing to different communities. The immutable divine will is the content of divinely made law, and political or conventional justice is the content of human law. St. Thomas Aquinas. The writings of St. Thomas Aquinas on law, recorded largely in the Summa Theologica, have dominated the thinking of Catholic jurists for centuries. Aquinas propounded the scholastic theory of law in the middle of the 13th century. He defined law as an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by him who has the care of the community and promulgated. His theory may be summarized thus: the world is ruled by divine providence, and therefore the divine law is supreme in the world. A part of the divine law is given by God himself to man in the scriptures, and they shall not be transgressed by any man-made law. And another part of divine law is revealed in the inherent reason of man and is called the natural law. He asserted the supreme authority of the Church as the custodian and interpreter of the divine laws. Aquinas' four categories of law. Aquinas' natural law theory contains four different types of law: eternal law, natural law, divine law, and human law. Lex eterna, that is the eternal law. This is God's plan for the universe. It is God's rational direction of all created things. All things are ruled, therefore, by this law. All things must obey it, but man who has free will has the capacity to disobey. The eternal law in its totality is known to God only, but some blessed persons may perceive it in its full truth. The eternal law is the plan of divine providence and therefore is absolutely perfect. Lex naturalis, the natural law. This is discoverable by human reason. This should emerge from man's exercise of his reason in the light of God's word. Because man possesses God-given reason, he may share in divine reason and derive from it a natural inclination to such actions and ends as are fitting. The natural law results from man's participation in the workings of the cosmic law. It is perfect, but not absolutely perfect. Lex divina, the divine law. This is God's law as revealed in the scriptures. It is God's positive law for mankind. It is revealed in the scriptures like 10 commandments. Although not identical with natural law, it is not contrary to it. Divine revelation, that is God's law, overcomes the limitations of the law known through human reason and provides a guide for man's reason, allowing his nature to be perfected by divine grace. Lex humana, the human law. This is humanly posited law. It is enacted for the common good. It is supported by reason. It provides the details to solve day-to-day problems. It involves uses of the natural law. Human law, which conforms to the law of reason, must conform to the law of God. Aquinas recognizes 4 kinds of law: the eternal, the natural, the divine, and the human. The last 3 all depend on the first, but in different ways. Were we to arrange them in a hierarchy, eternal would be at the top, then natural, then human. Divine law is not in conflict with natural law, but it reaches human beings by a different route, that is revelation. Aquinas made a distinction between lex eterna and lex naturalis, of which the former is the reason of divine wisdom governing the whole universe, while the latter is the law of human nature, proceeding ultimately from God, but immediately from human nature, and governing the actions of men only. He said that man, being a rational creature, participates in eternal reason. Thus, that part of the eternal law which man's reason reveals is to be called natural law. As regards lex humana was concerned, it embodied the primary precepts of natural law. The precepts of human law are to live honorably, to injure no one, to give every man his due. According to Aquinas, human law or positive law must remain within the limits of that of which it is a part. He pleaded for establishing the authority of the church over the law. In the words of Aquinas, the eternal law is the plan of divine providence and therefore is absolutely perfect. The natural law, on the other hand, is only imprint of the eternal law, which is finite and cannot be absolutely perfect. The positive law or the human law is really an implementation of natural law and varies with changing circumstances and conditions of social life. To sum up, the eternal law, the natural law, and the human law form a continuous series. The whole series may be compared to a tree, with the eternal law for its root, the natural law for its trunk, and the different systems of human law for its branches. Wherever the soil is not too bad and the climate favorable, the tree sends forth its splendid flowers of justice and equity and yields the fruits of peace and order, virtue and happiness. Indeed, peace is the fruit of justice. According to Aquinas, the law of nature is the foundation of all human law. No positive enactment which runs counter to the law of nature can be regarded as law. The primacy of natural law is the fundamental starting point of the Thomistic philosophy of law. Unjust laws. When is a law not law? Aquinas argued that in the light of natural law principles, laws framed by men are either just or unjust. A law is not law merely because it is decreed by a sovereign. Where a law has the appropriate moral dimension and is ordained to the common good, it is a just law. Hence, where it conforms to natural law, it is just. Laws may be unjust in two ways. A law which is contrary to human good, either in respect of its form or end, is no law at all. It cannot bind in conscience. A law which is opposed to the divine good and therefore a violation of the natural law must be disregarded. Laws of this kind should not be observed because we ought to obey God rather than man. Thus, Aquinas asserted that lex injusta non est lex, which means unjust law is no law. The problem of right to private property. In the controversy for power, the state, which was organized on a feudal foundation, conceded the right of private property to be a natural and inviolable right of the acquirer. But the Catholic Church refused to recognize the private property to be a natural right. This gave an impetus to the state over the church, and consequently, positive law came to prevail over religion and compelled divine law or natural law to recede to the background of social life. The position became stronger for positive law with the revolutions marked by the Renaissance and Reformation, which brought forth the spiritual emancipation of the individual and the emergence of the modern state. The individual wanted protection of their life and liberty. The Protestants denied authority of the church to expound the law of God. In this new setup, the theory of natural law came again to prominence, but was set on a new basis. It was no more a divine law with a spiritual authority, it became the law of the reason with intellectual authority. Neo-scholasticism and the natural law. Today's neo-scholastic movement in the field of natural law is concerned with the further development and adaptation of the teaching of Aquinas on law. The prominent members of the neo-scholastic school are Dabin, Ramen, Leifer, Lucy, and Maritain. Alder, a prominent American advocate of a contemporary natural law, in his Dialectic of Morals, notes 6 widely held principles derived directly from Aquinas, which have unusual relevance for law today. They are: government-made laws do not constitute the sole directions of human conduct which ought to apply to persons within society. There can be discovered rules and principles with application to all persons in all types of society. General principles of conduct exist outside man-made rules of law. These principles will emerge through man's exercise of his reason. General principles resulting from man's reason should be the source of all particular rules of conduct. These general principles can provide an overall standard by which the rules of law may be judged. This lesson is aimed at understanding of the Thomistic legal philosophy of Middle Ages and its relevance to the present day jurisprudence.